the female reproductive system. Every person watching this video was developed in a female reproductive system before you were born. It's sort of our first home if you think about it. In this video, we're going to take a look at the internal structures of the female reproductive system. Then we're going to take a look at the external genitalia, and then we'll come back to the torso model to take a look three-dimensionally at how these structures are arranged. So let's jump to the whiteboard and get started. Here in the sagittal cross-section, we can see a leg. On the anterior side, we see part of the pelvic bone, or really the cartilage between the two halves of the pelvis. On the posterior side, we have the colon, as well as the anus, where the colon connects to the outside of the body. And then we have the spine drawn posterior to that. Those are just some of the nearby structures on the sagittal view to help us see where these reproductive organs are. Here on the anterior side of the sagittal cross-section, just inferior to the pelvic bone, is the clitoris. The clitoris is composed of erectile tissue, which will fill with blood during sexual stimulation and arousal. It's actually a homologous structure to the male penis. I'm going to refer to several homologous structures throughout this video. Any homologous structure means that a fetus, when it's developing before sexual differentiation, in other words, before the sexual organs of the fetus develop into the male form or the female form, they start as the same structure. So there's an undifferentiated organ in the fetus that'll either become the glands of the penis or it becomes the clitoris, depending on the presence of more testosterone or more estrogen during development of the fetus. Just posterior to the clitoris, we have the urethra. The urethra in the female reproductive system is very short. It's going to run from the outside of the body just up to the bladder. The bladder here, of course, is connected to the kidneys via two ureters. So, of course, whenever the kidneys filter out water and waste from the blood, which we call urine, that urine will travel down the ureters into the bladder, and then during urination, that urine will travel from the bladder through the urethra to the outside of the body. If you remember, in the male reproductive system, the urethra is connected to the male reproductive system via the vas deferens. But in the female reproductive system, the urinary tract is kept separate from the reproductive parts. Now, anterior to the urethra is the vagina. The vagina extends from the outside of the body superiorly to the uterus. The vagina is primarily composed of elastic tissue which can extend. Now, surrounding the vagina are two glands called the Bartholin's glands or the greater vestibular glands. The primary function of the Bartholin's or greater vestibular gland is to produce mucus to lubricate the vagina. Now, on the most superior part of the vagina, right where it connects to the uterus, there's this U-shaped part right here, and that's called the fornix. The most posterior and inferior part of the uterus, where it connects to the vagina, is called the cervix. And cervical cancer is cancer of the cervix, or this part of the uterus that connects to the vagina right here. Now, here we have the uterus. The uterus is going to be the site of development of an embryo and then a fetus during a pregnancy. Now, there's different parts of the uterus. We have the fundus, we have the body of the uterus, and then the cervix of the uterus. And this internal part, or the inside lining of the uterus, is called the endometrium. During menstruation, that endometrium, or that internal lining of the uterus, is what comes out through the vaginal canal during menstruation or during the period. Extending out from the uterus on either side are the fallopian tubes, and here at the end of the fallopian tubes are the ovaries. The ovaries are the site of oogenesis, yep, two O's there, which is the process of development of an egg cell to get ready for fertilization. These sort of pre-egg cells that we call oocytes undergo the process of meiosis, where they're reduced from the 46 chromosomes down to 23 chromosomes. Then during fertilization, 23 chromosomes will come from the egg, 23 from the sperm, to create a new set of 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs of chromosomes for that zygote. That process of releasing an egg from the ovary is called ovulation. When ovulation occurs, an egg cell will get released from the ovary and it'll travel through the fallopian tube. If sexual intercourse happens and sperm cells enter into the uterus, those sperm cells will fertilize the egg while the egg is in the fallopian tube. If the egg cell gets fertilized and becomes a zygote, then that zygote will split into 2 cells, and then into 4 cells, and into 8 cells, and so on. Eventually, whenever that ball of cells reaches the uterus, it'll implant into the endometrium, where it's going to get nutrients from the mother's bloodstream, and it'll continue growing and becoming an embryo and then a fetus. If fertilization does not occur, then that egg cell will break down while it's in the fallopian tube, and then it will just come out during menstruation with the rest of the endometrium. Besides oogenesis and ovulation, the ovary is going to produce 2 hormones, estrogen and progesterone. So while I've got this diagram up, let's talk about tubal ligations. A tubal ligation is a type of female contraception that's very similar to a vasectomy, where the vas deferens is cut. In a tubal ligation, the fallopian tubes are cut and they're tied off, and that way sperm cells and egg cells cannot meet in the middle for fertilization. Of course, this has no effect on estrogen and progesterone production by the ovaries. The ovaries are surrounded by lots of blood vessels, and those hormones enter directly into the bloodstream from the ovaries via those blood vessels. Ovulation still occurs, menstruation still occurs. The main difference is that fertilization can't occur. Another common procedure is called a hysterectomy. A hysterectomy is a full removal of the uterus itself. This, of course, acts as a permanent contraception. There's going to be no fertilization of an egg cell. It would also cause menstruation to not to happen because the uterus itself is gone. A lot of times that's performed if somebody's at a higher risk of cervical cancer, because cervical cancer is cancer of the cervix. So if you remove that whole organ, then cervical cancer can't occur. Okay, now let's zoom out to the outside of the body and take a look at the external structures of the female reproductive system. Here we have the left leg, and here we have the right leg. Here's the anterior side, or the front, and then here's the posterior side, or the back of this region. This whole region here is called the vulva. All of these structures that I'm about to show collectively are called that, the vulva. Starting with the outside here, we have the labia majora, and inside of that we have the labia minora. The labia majora are larger skin folds that are often covered with hair, and inside of that are smaller skin folds called the labia minora, which are usually smooth and hairless. Here at the top of the diagram, or the most anterior part of this, is the clitoris. And the clitoris is covered by the clitoral fold. The clitoral fold is a homologous structure with the foreskin of the penis in the male reproductive system. Posterior to this, or below this on the diagram, is the urethral opening. And just posterior or below that in this diagram is the vaginal opening. On either side of the vaginal opening are going to be those Bertholin's glands, or the greater vestibular glands. And finally, posterior to all of that is the anus. So again, this whole area is called the vulva. We have the labia majora, the labia minora. We have the clitoris, the urethra, the vaginal opening, and the anus. All right, now let's jump back to the torso model and take a look at the three-dimensional structure of all of these. All right, so I've got the female reproductive system model here. Let's take a look. Let's start with the external structures. Here we're going to have the labia majora, and then just inside that we're going to have the labia minora. You can see it a little bit better if I open this up here. So labia majora, and then the labia minora just inside that. And this whole area is called the vulva. If we look from the superior part, we can see several structures. We have the uterus right here. We have the ovary and the fallopian tube on that side, and the ovary and the fallopian tube on this other side. And on the model, we can open up part of the uterus here to take a look inside there. Of course, this inner lining of the uterus is called the endometrium. And here's where that uterus connects to the fallopian tube on either side. If we could see down farther, we'd see where the cervix is. So uterus, the ovary, and fallopian tube. So let's take the model and let's open it up and look at the sagittal cross-section right here. Starting with the anterior side, we have the clitoris, which is the erectile tissue. We have the urethra, which connects to the bladder. Here we have the vaginal opening and the vagina. The Bartholin's or greater vestibular glands, we can't see these on this diagram here because they would be either here closer to the camera or on the other side of the vagina. Here is the fornix, where it sort of makes that U shape. And then we have the uterus. This bottom part of the uterus is called the cervix, the body of the uterus, and the fundus. If I remove this, we can see it a little bit better. Then we have the fallopian tube, which comes around and wraps to the ovary. If you look here, you'll see another piece of tissue that connects from the ovary to the uterus. That's actually the ovarian ligament, and that's just going to help hold the ovary in place. We also have something called the broad ligament, which is going to hold all of these structures in place as well. And then here in the back, we have the colon and the anus. All right, let's do a quick recap. Take a look at this sagittal and frontal cross-section. Pause the video and see if you can identify all of the structures as well as what they do. Starting with the anterior side, we have the clitoris, which is erectile tissue. We have the urethra, which connects up to the bladder. We have the vagina or the vaginal canal, the Bartholin's glands or the greater vestibular glands. Here's the cervix, which is the part of the uterus that's closest to the vagina. Here we have the uterus, which includes the fundus, the body, and the cervix. We have the inner lining of the uterus called the endometrium. That's going to be the part that develops during the menstrual cycle and then is menstruated or shed during menstruation. We have the fallopian tubes, which connect the uterus to the ovaries. The ovaries are the site of oogenesis and ovulation, where an egg gets released, where it has the chance to be fertilized by a sperm cell. Finally, in the posterior part of the diagram, we have the colon as well as the anus. Now, pause the video again and see if you can identify the external structures of the female reproductive system. Here we have the labia majora and the labia minora. Here is the clitoris. Below this on the diagram is the urethral opening. Here's the vaginal opening, and finally the anus. All right, great. You've made it to the end of the video. Hopefully you learned something about the female reproductive system. Now we just have another end credits for reproductive system video. So, don't know what else to talk about. I guess subscribe to see more videos. Okay, bye.